Hello and welcome to this month's edition of the Whisky Investment Podcast from VCL Vintners. I'm Alwynne Gwilt, whisky journalist, and today I'm going to be joined by Ben Lancaster, co-founder and owner of VCL Vintners. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. So for those listeners out there who maybe haven't caught one of our older versions of the podcast, we've had the great chance to chat before about your role, but for those people who don't know you, can you do a little intro and give a bit of explanation behind what you do?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot, obviously.
Yeah, well, some would say not a lot. But, yeah, so I'm one of the co-owners and myself, business partner Stuart.
Yeah.
And part of my day-to-day remit in terms of the business, having been there since for nearly 15 years, managing client portfolios, acquisition of stock, general day-to-day, operational sort of remit as well. Yep. So it's a multifunctional role and keeps you busy basically whilst you're trying to juggle everything else.
Yeah, so. I can imagine. Today we're going to talk a bit more about casks and partnerships and things behind the scenes. But could you give a little insight, I guess, into what is going on in the cask management, the cask buying space, from your perspective, and where you sit in your current role?
Yeah, no, I think whiskey is one of those industries where I think historically, or from an outside perspective, people see it as sort of can be a bit old school. But there's always a lot happening, and in terms of even the cask management systems that are now being implemented, there's a real focus on bringing in technology in order to sort of utilize that management, ensure that things are being done as accurately as they can. And I think from a cask acquisition perspective, we've seen some shifts. I think there's always an ebb and a flow in terms of availability. And ultimately what we've seen at the moment, there seems to be a wee bit more stock or access, which is not a bad thing. I think there's been one eye on some emerging markets and anticipation of demand spiking based upon that. And I think where that agreement or that new market hasn't unfolded yet, there's an element of liquid, which is cash for a distillery. And I think that they're more open-minded now to releasing a little bit more because the stock flow is maybe over and above where it should be, which it would be the same in any industry, no matter what. I think any producer who has a bit more of their inventory is naturally going to want to cash that in and ensure that their revenue is there.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think, about, the Scotch whiskey industry, because it's one of the oldest, certainly out there, but certainly around the whiskey space, is just this concept that it is a long-term play. So I think, when we're talking about these changes and things happening, you need to be looking across 10, 15, 20 years. Within that framework, I suppose, what would you say are some of the emerging trends that are kind of starting to set the tone for the coming years? Is it that technology side? Is that a big part of it? What would you say is a big focus?
It's a good point. I think whiskey first of all is a mid to long term play, right? Yeah. And from an investment perspective, which we specialize in investments, we've got different arms to the business that focus on different elements of the industry, but we are primarily a cask brokerage. I think that the fact that it is a mid to long term investment, it gives you the capability to withstand economic volatility, right, or even market volatility, because when you take a long term view on anything, you're able to ride out if there's anything negative that's happening. I think what the future holds for the market is what we've seen previously. It's a really exciting space. New technology is infiltrating everything, every element of life, right? From AI to whatever it may be. And I think ultimately when you introduce tech into an industry like whiskey, which has always had tech in some capacity, like it might have been production techniques that were pushing boundaries at a certain time or period. I think that adding tech to the management systems to, like things like angel share, if you can get to grips with that, if you're a major producer with 100 million litres and you can find a way of navigating a 2% angel share down to a 0.5% angel share.
That's huge.
It's huge in terms of liquid. It's also huge in terms of revenue. And that's what you could really see unfolding at the moment. And that's why I think is the marriage of traditional and tech is it's a really exciting partnership. And I think had it not been so exciting, I don't think you get as much appetite for it as you're seeing right now.
So do you think in that sense of things that distilleries are actually embracing technology, or are they still a little bit hesitant to get involved in that space?
I think they've always embraced tech.
Yeah.
I think by definition they're naturally tech-minded from a business perspective, right? It might be about
distillation or
distillation,
that.
as I mentioned earlier on. It could be distillation, but also it could be, you know, finding ways of enhancing production in order to generate more cash, right? If you look at it from a purely business perspective. But I think what you've probably seen right now is that the tech that's been used and has always been within the industry, as the market's grown, as the appetite's grown, as the market has come more to the forefront than it has, you're finding out that actually tech's always been a big part of it. Cask management systems have always been there, and it's one of those things when you look back, it's like, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? It's like you're not going to have 10,000 casks and no one's going to have some system of you know,
it might have been a ledger book,
maybe
in pencil,
exactly,
but
maybe
still...
you know, 70, 80 years ago, but you know, tech's been around since the internet, so it's not like it's not beyond the power to sort of realize actually, it makes sense. But I think there's within that space now there's competition, because you've had the introduction of, say, blockchain, you know, things like that, and you know, that's not been an avenue that's ever been utilized. There's been inventory management systems, but they've probably been quite archaic. You know, the you know, very simple, and like an Excel system would have been seen as mind-blowing at some point. So I think the introduction of blockchain will really change things, because it has the ability to influence the industry in a lot of different ways, whether it's proof of ownership, you know, information ledgers, and everything that comes with it. So I think it will have it's already having an impact, but I think the impact it has will continue to grow, and where that ends up, you know, that's an exciting prospect in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting, I think, as well, seeing the newer distilleries come online almost with a lot of that tech already implemented.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then seeing how the older players are kind of almost playing catch up in some ways. So it's a bit of a back and forth, I think, between
it's two things. The older players are like, oh, they're doing it, and they're like, oh, they're onto us because now we've been doing it. So, you know, but the newer distilleries, I think from the get-go, you know, the tech is really, it's really implemented, and I think you can really see the difference in that. Rather than retrofitting it, it's something that's right from the start. It's ingrained in what they're doing now, and I think that probably reinforces the importance of it from that perspective.
Super interesting. And in terms of the cask side, what are some of the hurdles at the moment, would you say, or challenges being faced?
I don't think there's too many hurdles that are unexpected. I think you have the traditional ones, right, which is, you know, management in general, you know, and for a company like our size, with the number that we have, you know, by no means small, but like compared to a major distillery owner, by no means large, but it's still the day-to-day operational stuff that is important. It's not a hurdle, it's just a byproduct of the area that you work in. And I think it's ensuring for us that the management we offer is to the best it can be, because what we're interested in is maximizing that resale value for clients, and the asset is where the value is. So we put all of our efforts into ensuring that we're able to have all the information that's pertinent and necessary at the given moment when it's there. So I don't think there's any particular hurdles or challenges which are outside the norm. Is so probably the best way to look
fairly
at it.
Expected.
You know,
just the general things you need to be considering within the space.
And we're fortunate the team we've got have a lot of expertise in that field, and you know, that makes a big difference from an owner's perspective, because you know, as the business has grown, that side of the business has grown, and whereas before it might have been something that myself or Stuart would have managed and taken the reins of, adding to our workload, the truth of the matter is that now we have people in those areas who are much more well equipped than we are, and have a lot more expertise, and have been doing that for decades.
You know, I guess when we look at the history of both your company and the development of cask ownership that's just generally been happening, or cask brokerage that's generally been happening across the industry, something that pops up a lot is this debate about whether or not older casks are worthwhile, and I was curious, you know, how difficult is it to get a hold of these older stocks when we're seeing more and more companies releasing, you know, the oldest whiskey they've ever released and bottling it. We've been seeing a few recently. Is that a real focus for you, or is there value in actually getting things earlier on a whiskey's journey?
It's actually a good question. I mean, look, we're really fortunate. So if you think of our existence of 15 years,
Yeah.
you know, we were buying casks that now you either wouldn't find or you would pay an extremely high amount of money
Yeah.
for them, right?
Yeah.
So from an inventory perspective, we are lucky enough to have 55-year-old casks. We have 50, one's turning 56 end of next month.
Yeah.
It's, you mentioned about there is two ends of the market, right?
Yeah.
There is new make and there's old and rare.
Yeah.
That's a big spread. It can be anything from new makes out the still and
Yeah.
50, 55 or 45, 35, whatever age statement it happens to be. But we don't, for us, it's the value. Yeah.
Okay.
Rarity, rarity drives value.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're fortunate enough we can look back from assets we bought 8 years ago, 10 years ago, and look at what we're being offered today. And it's like, well, we're not that, that we have that in stock already. We don't need to go and find that. We don't need to acquire it.
Yeah.
And because there's been such a premiumization of the sector, like releases that you're seeing of 55-year-olds and stuff like that. And, like the Macallan 1926 that sold for 2 million is, it's a black swan, right? It's completely different. Yeah, exactly. They don't just arrive. But the fact that you have limited edition releases of, like the recent one of Glenlivet 55-year-old, which is, I think they've done 100 bottles, give or take. But there is an appetite for that, and there's a market for it, and I think it's showing the shift of things as well. So from an investment, we don't discriminate on either end effectively.
Right.
For us, there's value in new make,
Yeah.
there's value in old and rare. It's more the exit strategy as well. You've got to take that into account, because you get an older cask and the ABV is a little bit lower. You've got to weigh that up whether or not you want to take that cask, because the liquid's great and the producer's excellent, but at the same time, if we're within a margin on the ABV, then it's like, well, that puts a different slant on the time frame, and it also puts a different slant on how we exit, because that may not be a cask transaction. That may need to go into glass. That may need to bottle.
Preserve it,
so it just adds the two ends of the market. We have to operate in a different way. I think most people can sort of accept that when you get a new make cask, that is not a great deal you need to be overly concerned about or thinking about. It's just, but at the same breath, that new make with a long enough hold, and with a fair wind with angel share and stuff like that then becomes old and rare. So you can get that full cycle, and we factor that in on our long-term strategy anyway, and we look at what we've got in new make, where that's going to be in terms of value and appreciation for us and the clients, and then where we can potentially take it, and all of that is factored into, as I said, to the long-term strategy that we adopt as a company.
Wow. So very different approaches that need to be taken depending on which aspect you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
And you also have some distillery partnerships as well. Is that helping you to access casks, or what is the importance behind things like that from a cask investment perspective?
It's everything, right? It's anything purchased on the secondary market, the pricing is always going to be different. The moment you have a direct link or a direct source, it's a completely different landscape for you. And for us, we've always put a lot of importance into having those relationships, because it's not the long-term relationships that you're building, and the reason they're important is because the access it gives us as a company, but more importantly, the value it gives the clients, right? And we've always taken that approach. No matter what, we've always tried to get to the top of to the top of the source, because effectively, as I said, the value's there, and it means you're in a really strong position. And not just that, like those relationships we have direct with distilleries or the owners of distilleries, you have new make, right? And it might be the tankers and that side of things, but also you get access to older casks. And it may not be something you always take, but at the same time, it's something that you have to offer. And for us, where the business has grown and we've added different lines to the business with the bottlings, etc. Those older casks that come available could then be things that we will put into glass, irrespective of an investment, and it becomes a special release for us or something along those lines. So you couldn't have that without the direct access to those distilleries and building those relationships, and it's taken us time to do it. And I think when the business was a little bit in its infancy in the market, infancy in terms of age, it's like anything, right? You can have all the will in the world, but at some stage you need something to click in order to get that relationship going. And I think that recruitment we've done the people we've brought in,
Mhm.
that's really probably helped us. Like we've always been known in Scotland because we were one of the first companies to,
Yeah.
well, we were the first company to do this. So, you know, we're known at north of the border in terms of what we bring to the table. But having, you know, the sort of recruitment we've done has helped us get those contracts and get those relationships. So I think it's a combination of the maturity of the company, but also the sort of the excellent acquisition we've done in terms of who we brought on.
Yeah, and as you say, 15 years, it depends which industry, but a
Yeah.
lot has happened in 15 years
Yeah.
in the whiskey industry.
Particularly the last 15 years, right?
Exactly.
And we've seen, and as a company, we've been really fortunate. And I think that, as I alluded to earlier on, that if you look at what's happened in terms of cask pricing
Mhm.
and the stock that we have under management and things like that, you know, we cultivated it at a really sweet spot in terms of that, you know, for want of a better expression. It's not the best expression, sweet spot, but I'll run with it anyway. But yeah, so we are fortunate. But yeah, it's not, you know, we're not Barclays Bank who've been going for 200 years, but at the same time, in terms of investment in casks and the way the market's grown, the 15 years that we've been here have probably been the most important ones so far. And I think there'll be more milestones to come from an industry perspective.
Yeah.
And long may they continue. And I think the dynamic's always changing anyway. So
Yeah. And is that from a global perspective rather than just
both? I think domestically and globally. I think that, you know, you've seen a lot of changes in Scotch, but I think if you look outside of that into other industries or spirit sectors, there's been enormous changes.
Yeah.
You know, and whether that's a COVID knock on or a change of approach, but I think I think most people accept that when most Scotch is successful in an area, others will follow.
Yeah.
Right. And if those Scottish distilleries can penetrate a new market and set the standard, all of a sudden, you know, bourbon will follow. Or you know, that's the kind of trend that happens because Scotch has the pedigree. It's able to. It won't domestically might not do it, like, you know, but in America, for instance, Scotch is a powerhouse, right? It's heavily demanded. Like, bourbon is their homegrown spirit, but at the same time, there's a big demand for Irish whiskey. There's a big demand for Scotch.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting landscape globally, but I think domestically there's a lot going on as well.
And in terms of, there's been a lot of conversations, I would say, in the news, certainly in the whiskey press recently, just about the potential squeeze on Scotch whiskey, about exports dropping, a lot of doom and gloom. You're obviously in the investment space, so you are used to seeing ups and downs because that is generally what happens within the market. Are you as concerned as other people, or do you feel like this is just par for the course?
I think I'm more concerned about the UK's economy generally, what's happening. But I think if you look at Scotch, for instance, look, you know, there's been a drop in exports. But then it's about how you read it. Okay, so you might look at the drop in exports, for instance, on a macro scale, and you say, all right, that's dropped. But then how much has it dropped by? How much from COVID had it increased? And how much has it dipped? And also at the same time, look at markets. So there's been a drop in exports of Scotch globally, but India imports are up by 17%. So it's how you look at it, right? You're either glass half full or glass half empty. And I think that when you look at a huge landscape or market like India, and the fact that exports are up by 17%, or you look at, I'm not one for picking certain countries, right? I think India is a continent, is enormous, but like if China, for instance, exports to China have continued to grow year on year over the last decade. There's an appetite from those markets, and they're still considered emerging. You know, and that's, you know, there's been a lot of talk about a trade agreement with India, and you know, that I think that the fact that sales are up or exports are up 17% there would really reinforce the importance of that trade agreement should it happen. And then this has been something that's been spoken about for a long time, that the trade agreement has anyway. But I think there seems to be a real effort to make it happen this time. You know, so I think that
the will is there, and or it's going to have a big impact.
Exactly. Well, primarily, it's, you know, it has massive implications for the Scottish whiskey market. But I think, you know, I prattled on a little bit with the answer, but I think generally speaking, you know, look, in terms of those export numbers, for us, when we look at it from an investment perspective, we're going to analyse them a lot more differently. And I don't think the dip has been significant enough to warrant any alarm. I think it's more than rational to think that actually the COVID spike has naturally had to come down a little bit. And the fact that it's come down as much as it has or how small as it has, I think that gives you an indication that actually things are a lot more robust than it's being portrayed at the moment, you know?
It's not just a quick headline number. It's about behind the scenes. As you say, that was a bit of an overinflated bump that we had during that period of time.
Everyone was stuck at home drinking. So, what do you expect? You know, everyone was running out of cardboard, but I mean, everyone wanted a drink.
No corks or glass.
Yeah, exactly. You couldn't get tomatoes in a tin, but you can get a bottle of whiskey. So it's just, I think it's just a bit of it's a minor correction. But I think one thing that the Scottish whisky industry has always done is been adaptable. And I think they've shown that in the way they approach things. And I think that they'll see that, and I think they'll recognise that, and I think that there'll be a shift in approach. And the great thing for Scottish whisky is that it's the assistance they get is on a government level. And in Scotland, for instance, the benefit is they have two governments who are trying to help them out.
Really invested in actually being successful.
It's a huge revenue draw, not just for the UK, but for Scotland on the whole, and it impacts people's lives and their work lives, which then impacts taxation or whatever else. So I think that the fact that on the government level, there's an interest in ensuring that, and you know, the UK government have said one of the first things they did was go to Scotland and reinforce the fact that they were supportive as an industry. Then, you know, they have the right mechanisms there and the right people to speak to say, well, look, we may need to do this, or we may need to do that, and that will bring about change. So I think that the market is in, again, there's been a dip, but I think it's strong enough to bounce back.
And as we look into 2025, anything you're keeping your eye on, any emerging trends or where your focus point will be?
We have been busy, and we've looked at new markets, as you would imagine, right? So, you know, we Scotch is always primarily what we work with. It's, you know, pedigree, asset, proven track record. But as a company, we've expanded. The global spirits industry around the world is worth a lot of money, and also those spirit sectors are now starting to grow. I think I mentioned earlier on about premiumization, but I think as a knock-on effect of that, you know, premiumization, I think appetite's changed. People are more aware of the spirit sector. You know, gin had its kind of run and things like that, but what we've seen with sort of whiskey in particular is that you've had Scotch, bourbons now. Bourbon domestically in the US was huge. You know, like, and that's the yin and the yang with the two industries, because Scotch, the exports are large, domestically small and naturally, but then in the US you've got a huge domestic market, but the export side of things is a little bit different. So, you know, we're aware of other markets, we're not ignorant to them, and we've ensured that we've pinpointed the right distilleries and people to work with in those areas. So I think for what's ahead, you know, we want to maintain what we've been doing, but we've also got the independent bottles we're working on. We've got projects in the States, you know, direct access in Ireland, for instance. So it's an exciting time. I think for us as a company, it's an exciting time. But I also think, you know, in terms of the market, also there's a lot to be positive about.
That's a really nice note to end on, Ben. Thank you so much. It's always fascinating to get your insights, both behind the scenes in the whiskey industry, but also from the company perspective as well. And I'm sure investors will be very interested to hear what you've had to say.
It's good to see you again. Thank you.
It's very good to see you.
Appreciate the time.
Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast this month.
Thank you.